Short is the story, long is the life.
Wukong's archive presents China Urban Legends, The Confucius Forest of Qufu. In the autumn of 2004, I went to Qufu in Shandong to deliver a batch of old books. The work wasn't heavy. I finished by the afternoon, and that evening I stayed at a small inn next to the old campus of Qufu Normal University. Qufu Normal is separated from the Confucius Temple by only one wall. The old campus dormitory building hugs the temple's east wall, and from the balcony students can see the roof ridge of Konglin Pavilion. When the innkeeper's wife heard I'd come to deliver books, she said, "You've come at the right time. In a few days it's Master Confucius's birthday, and the Konglin will be closed for sacrificial rites. If you want to see it, go these next 2 days."
I said, "Isn't the Konglin open every day? Buy a ticket during the day and go in."
The innkeeper's wife said, "Daytime is for tourists." The Konglin is the Kong family's burial ground, over 2,000 years old, and everyone buried in the forest is a member of the Kong family. If you go during the day, it's just a scenic spot. But if you run into an overcast or rainy day, and dusk catches you still inside, then you'll know that place is different from other scenic spots. My grandfather was a forest guard, and when he was alive he said the trees in the Konglin recognize people.
I said, "How can trees recognize people?"
The innkeeper's wife didn't answer. She turned and went to tend to something else.
Qufu is not like other places. It was the ancient capital of the state of Lu, the fief of Duke Zhou, and the place where Confucius taught. The old town still has a full circuit of Ming Dynasty city walls. The main south gate is called the 10,000 Ren Palace Wall, and on the top of the wall are carved 4 large characters, Jin Shang Yuzhen. The bell sounds, the jade chime resounds. Inside the city, ancient buildings are everywhere. The Confucius Temple, the Confucius Mansion, and the Konglin, together known as the 3 Kongs, take up most of the town. Ask any 10 locals you meet on the street, and 8 of them can tell you a tale about the 3 Kongs, and tell it with such vivid detail you'd think they'd seen it with their own eyes.
I hadn't had much interest in the Konglin to begin with. The next morning, while drinking porridge at a street stall, I ran into Qi Xiaofeng. Qi Xiaofeng was the younger brother of my college classmate, a graduate student in history at Qufu Normal, writing his thesis on the Confucius Mansion archives. When he heard I was leaving the day after, he said, "Don't rush off. Tonight I'll take you into the Konglin for a look. I know old Master Zhou, the forest keeper. He has the key to the side gate."
I said, "Isn't the Konglin a scenic spot? Anyone can go in during the day. Why would you need a key?" Qi Xiaofeng smiled. "Daytime it's a scenic spot. At night, the Konglin is the Konglin."
With just those words, I stayed. That afternoon, Qi Xiaofeng took me to see old Zhou. His full name was Zhou Baotian. He was 67 that year and had kept the Konglin for over 40 years. His father had been a forest guard, and his grandfather too. By Qufu's old custom, all the land around the Konglin belonged to the Confucius Mansion. Those who farmed it were called tenant farmers, and those who watched the forest were called forest guards. The forest guards lived at the edge of the forest for generations, and when they died they were buried on the outer perimeter of the Konglin. Old Zhou's family was exactly that way. Starting with his grandfather, they'd lived in that lane outside the west wall of the Konglin, 3 generations in a row. Old Zhou was thin, dark, and spoke slowly in a thick Qufu dialect. When he heard Qi Xiaofeng say he wanted to bring me into the forest, he looked me up and down and said, "You can go in, but let's get the rules straight first. Once you're in the forest, don't step on grave mounds, don't pick cypress leaves, don't call anyone's name, and you must be out before dark."
I said, "I heard the Konglin is sealed at night." Old Zhou said, "What's sealed is the tourist gate. Whether the forest seals itself is the forest's own business."
I didn't understand that. Old Zhou didn't explain either. He turned and went into the house, brought me half a bundle of incense, and said, "Tomorrow at dawn, come in through the west side gate. I'll take you around." The half bundle of incense was a string of slender jaw sticks wrapped in yellow paper, and it gave off a heavy sandalwood smell. I only learned later that there were plenty of people selling incense at the Konglin gate, but old Zhou's incense was different from the ones outside. He made it himself by hand. The craft of rolling incense had been passed down to him by Master Lu. Who Master Lu was, that was the person I'd hear old Zhou mention on my third day at the Konglin. That evening, I ate at a small restaurant at the mouth of the lane. When the owner heard I was staying at old Zhou's place, he gave me a couple extra looks. "Old Zhou doesn't talk much," he said. "If you stay at his place and hear any sounds at night, don't spread it around." I said, "What sounds?" The owner said, "Sounds from the forest. If you hear them, pretend you didn't. If you don't hear anything, that's your good fortune." I asked him, "What are these sounds from the forest?" The owner waved his hand. "Don't ask. If you ask, I'll have to tell you. And if I tell you, I won't be able to sleep tonight." The next morning, I followed old Zhou into the woods through the west side gate of the Confucius forest.
The Confucius forest was huge. Frighteningly huge. More than 3,000 mu of land, over 100,000 graves, over 100,000 pines and cypresses. Burials had gone on without a break from the spring and autumn and warring states periods down to the Republic era. More than 2,000 years. Old Zhou said that after Confucius died, his disciples came from all the states and kept vigil at his tomb for 3 years, and Zi Gong alone stayed another 3. The mourners settled down and became the first forest households. From then on, descendants of the Kong family, tenants of the Kong family, students of the Kong family, when they died, they were buried in the forest generation after generation, for over 2,000 years.
I asked him, with 100,000 graves, does anyone still remember who's in all of them? Old Zhou said, the ones who are remembered have names on their tablets. The ones who aren't remembered just become a mound of dirt. But the dirt is still Confucius forest dirt, and people still burn paper money for them just the same.
We followed the spirit path deeper in. On both sides stood stone figures and stone beasts. Civil officials, military generals, qilin, stone tigers, each one standing in the morning mist. Old Zhou pointed at those stone beasts and said, "These are from the Ming dynasty, over 600 years old. Don't come here alone at night."
I asked, why? Old Zhou said, the stone beasts move. If you don't hear it, they don't move. If you do hear it, they move for you to see.
I thought he was joking. Old Zhou didn't laugh. He led me on to the second forest gate. The second forest gate was a memorial archway at the north end of the spirit path, with 3 characters carved on its lintel. Forest of the Supreme Sage. On either side of the gate stood 2 stone figures, one civil and one military, taller than a real person. Old Zhou said these 2 stone figures were called Weng Zhong. The military one held a sword, the civil one held a tablet, and they stood guard over the Confucius forest. He added, when Weng Zhong guards the gate, by day they face inward, watching the woods. By night they turn around and face outward. If you pass by here at midnight and see the civil Weng Zhong with his back to you, don't say a word, walk on quickly. If you're too slow, he'll start asking you questions. I asked him, Weng Zhong can talk?
Old Zhou said, things that guard gates can all talk. Whatever they say, don't answer.
I didn't dare ask any more. I followed him straight ahead until we stopped at the head of the Zhushui Bridge. He pointed at the dry riverbed below and said, down under there, in the 7th month, you can hear the sound of water. It was autumn of 2004. The sky was clear, and there wasn't a drop of water under the bridge. I settled in at old Zhou's place. His courtyard was outside the west wall of the Confucius forest, 3 tiled rooms, and in the yard an old locust tree with a stone mill set beneath it. I slept in the east wing and lay down a little past 10. Autumn nights in Qufu are cold, so I shut the window tight, but I couldn't fall asleep, tossing and turning, my head full of those stone men and stone beasts I'd seen during the day. Around 1 in the morning, I heard the sound. It sounded like someone dragging something very heavy across the ground, one drag, then another, very slow, very heavy. It wasn't coming from the alley. It came from the direction of the Confucius forest, muffled through the wall. At first I thought it was a cart hauling stone, but listening closer, that wasn't right. Cartwheels make a continuous sound. This was one drag at a time, with extremely faint stone against stone noises in between, like dozens of things shifting across the ground all at once. The sound went on for about 10 odd minutes, then stopped all of a sudden. I threw on my coat and went out to stand in the yard and listen. The night was still. The forest side was pitch dark, no sound at all. The old locust leaves rustled in the wind. I stood there for a while, felt a chill run down my back, and went back in. The next morning, I asked old Zhou, was somebody hauling stone over by the forest last night? Old Zhou was squatting by the stove boiling water. When he heard my question, his hand paused. He said, "You heard it?"
I said, "Heard it." It went on for over 10 minutes.
Old Joe didn't reply. He finished boiling the water, poured me a bowl and only then said, "That wasn't hauling stone. That was the stone xiangxing." I asked him what the stone xiangxing were. Old Joe said, "The 20-plus stone men and beasts on both sides of the spirit path. From the Ming dynasty, they're collectively called the stone xiangxing. Over 600 years, they've never moved from their spots. But every year, there are always 1 or 2 nights when a dragging stone sound comes from the forest. The elders say that's the stone xiangxing shifting positions on their own. When they're done, they shift back before dawn. So in the daytime, everything looks the same as always." I asked him, "How many stone xiangxing are there altogether?" Old Joe said, 20-some, plus the 2 Weng Zhong statues at the second forest gate, 26 in all. One statue, one position. In over 600 years, they've never been out of order. But if one day you count and there's one extra, don't make a sound, pretend you didn't see it, and especially don't count a second time.
I said, "Then why do they shift positions?"
Old Joe took a drink of water and said, "The elders say they're inspecting the forest, checking which grave needs repairing, which steel needs raising. When they're done, they go back and stand."
I said, "You believe that?"
Old Joe said, "I entered the forest when I was 18. That's 49 years now. That kind of sound you're talking about, I've heard it 7 times. Every time, within a few days, something big happens in the forest for sure. The most accurate time was 1966. I asked, "What happened in 1966?
Old Joe didn't answer. He set down his bowl and said, "Let's eat." The Zhushui Bridge spans the southern edge of the cemetery of Confucius. The river beneath the bridge is called Zhushui, a branch that splits off from the Zi River. Over 2,000 years ago, in his later years, Confucius often taught between the Zhu and Zi rivers, and later generations called it the teachings of Zhu and Zi, referring to this very river. Qi Xiaofeng told me that the old campus of Qufu Normal University, where he studied, was built between the Zhu and Zi rivers. When the old professors there talked about the school's history, their first sentence was always about the teachings of Zhu and Zi. Old Zhou said that when he was a child, the Zhushui still had water, clear and bright in the summer, with kids rolling up their pant legs to catch fish under the bridge. All the children of the forest keepers went. The carp they caught were taken home and stewed into soup, fresh as could be. Then the water was gone. Old Zhou said it was in the 1960s when a canal was built upstream and the water was diverted. The Zhushui first grew thin, then simply stopped flowing. The riverbed was exposed, and gradually it turned into a dry ditch. Now grass grows thick beneath the bridge, and no one could tell a river ever ran here. Qi Xiaofeng said the historical records actually note it clearly. The Zhushui was dredged several times during the Ming and Qing dynasties, the last time being during the Guangxu reign. A few years after that work was done, it silted up again, and from then on, the river was finished. But the sound of water is still there.
Old Zhou said that every year in the 7th lunar month, there are always a few nights when the sound of water comes from beneath the dry riverbed, a rushing, splashing sound, like the river had swelled, or like someone was wading through water. The forest keepers living by the woods have all heard it. They hear it and say nothing, because saying anything wouldn't help anyway. Come daylight, you go look, and the riverbed is still dry, not even a wet trace. Qi Xiaofeng said he'd analyzed it, could be groundwater, could be wind passing through the hollows under the riverbed. He's read a lot, and he can explain it all very convincingly. Old Zhou listened and only said, he's read more, so whatever he says goes. I asked Old Zhou, then where does that water sound come from? Old Zhou said, don't know. My father said the spirit of the Zhushui is still there. The water dried up, but the spirit never left. It's still flowing under the riverbed. It flows its own way, you listen your own way, no trouble between you. I asked him, did your father see anything else?
Old Zhou was silent for a while, then said, when my father was young, one July, the river had already dried up. He was crossing the bridge at midnight when he heard people talking under the bridge, two people discussing something, their voices low, couldn't make out what they were saying. He crouched at the bridgehead and listened for a long while. When the two had finished their discussion, the water sound rose up, rushing and splashing for a long time. My father went home and never mentioned it to anyone. The next spring, a stone coffin was dug out of the riverbed empty, with carved patterns on the lid that nobody could recognize. The forest keepers buried it back that very night, back in the same place, filled in the earth, tamped it down firm, and planted a cypress tree on top.
I said, whose coffin was that? Old Zhou said, my father never said, not even to his dying day. He only said this much, what lies under the Zhushui is managed under the Zhushui. I said, is that stone coffin still under the riverbed?
Old Zhou said, it is. The cypress tree planted when they buried it back, it was cut down for firewood in 1966. The tree's gone, but the place is still there. Don't ask where. Even if you ask, I won't tell you.
I asked him again, under that riverbed, besides that stone coffin, is there anything else? Old Zhou said, there is. When the river was still alive, things were buried down there. The river dried up, but the things are still there. Look at those big stones under the bridge, they look like scattered rocks in the riverbed, but they were actually placed there by the older generation to hold something down. What they're holding down, don't go asking.
The oldest tree in the Kong forest isn't a cypress. It's a Chinese pistache tree, not far east of Confucius's tomb. The pistache, also called the Huanglan Mu, has hard wood and straight grain, making it excellent material for coffins. Old Zhou said this tree was planted by Zi Gong's own hands. After Confucius died, his disciples mourned for 3 years, then each returned to their own state. Zi Gong didn't leave. He built a thatched hut beside Confucius's tomb and mourned for another 3 years. During that time, he brought a pistache sapling from his hometown in Lu and planted it east of the tomb, watering it daily. By the time Zi Gong left 6 years later, the tree was already taller than a man. Over the next 2,000+ years, the trees before Confucius's tomb were replaced again and again. Only this pistache, dying and reviving and dying, never left that spot. East of Confucius's tomb stands a stone tablet inscribed with the words, Zi Gong's hut mourning site. A lu is a thatched hut. Old Zhou said that during those 6 years, people from Lu came to invite Zi Gong to take office, and he refused. His family sent word for him to come home, and he wouldn't. He just lived in that hut for 6 years, watching his teacher's grave every day.
I said, a tree can die and come back to life?
Old Zhou said, "That pistache is a strange thing. Forget everything else, just look at this one. During the Qin dynasty book burning, it withered once. At the end of the Tang dynasty, it withered again. Every time it withered, it was during great chaos in the realm. Withered for a few years, and when peace returned to the world, it sprouted new growth. The old folks said this tree keeps the records for the Kong forest. It doesn't record people, it records years." I said, "What about 1966? Old Zhou glanced at me and said, "In the winter of 1966, this pistache withered. All the cypresses in the Kong forest, too, looked like they'd been touched by frost. Their leaves turned gray and drooped. That winter was especially cold. Quite a few trees were cut down in the forest for firewood, but this pistache alone, nobody touched it. Not that they didn't dare. It was that nobody had the heart to. Withered as it was still planted by Zi Gong."
And then?
Then came 1979, early spring. A forest keeper was out on his morning rounds and saw buds sprouting on the south-facing branch of the pistache. Tender green, just the size of a fingernail. He ran back and called people. Half the forest's households came, ringed around that tree watching it for an entire morning. That night, old Zhou's father drank a round of liquor at home, drank too much and said one thing: "The tree's awake, so it's time for people to wake up too." Old Zhou said, "That pistache is still alive to this day. The north-facing branches are still withered. The south half puts out new leaves every year. When you go see it, half is dead, half is alive, and the living half faces directly toward the Confucius temple."
I went to see that tree later. The trunk is thick, too wide for two people to wrap their arms around. The bark is cracked and fissured, like the back of an old man's hand. The north branches stretch out bare, like charred bones. On the south branches, the leaves grow thick, so green they look almost black. When the wind blows, the whole tree rustles. That withered half on the north side rustles too, but the sound is dry and raspy. It doesn't sound like a tree. It sounds like something grinding its teeth.
I asked old Zhou, "Is that tree dead or alive? Can it really keep track of years?"
Old Zhou said, "Ask 10 people, get 10 answers. Some say the tree was replanted in the Ming dynasty, not the one Zi Gong planted. Some say the root is still the same root, just that the branches have been replaced over the generations. I believe what my grandfather said, and my grandfather believed what his grandfather said. What gets passed down, if you believe it, it's real. Outside the east wall of the Confucius temple, there's an unremarkable brick wall. In front of the wall stands a stone stele with 2 characters carved on it. Lu Bai, the Lu Wall."
Qi Xiaofeng once told me the story behind this wall. When Qin Shi Huang burned the books and buried scholars alive, the books of the entire realm were burned clean. Kongfu, the 9th-generation descendant of Confucius, hid a box of books, the Analects, the Book of Documents, the Classic of Filial Piety, and others from his family's collection, into a hollow space inside the walls of the old family residence under cover of night, then fled. Later, when chaos erupted at the end of the Qin dynasty, Kongfu died in the land of Qin, and the matter of that box of books was never known to anyone again.
By the time of Emperor Jing of the Han dynasty, Lu Yu, Prince Gong of Lu, was expanding his palace and needed to demolish Confucius's old residence. When the craftsmen tore into one of the walls, they suddenly heard from inside the wall the sound of metal, stone, silk, and bamboo, clinking and clanging, as if someone were strumming a zither and striking a chime stone inside the wall. The craftsmen were terrified and reported it to Prince Gong of Lu. The prince had the wall carefully opened, and inside they found a box of bamboo slips, precisely the books Kung Fu had hidden there. Later generations called this the Lu Wall yielding its books, and that box of books became what the classicists later called the Old Text Classics.
Qi Xiaofeng said that wall still stands today, right behind the Hall of Poetry and Ritual in the Confucius Temple. The Hall of Poetry and Ritual has its own origin story too. Legend says it was where Confucius taught his son Konglin to read. Confucius once stood in front of the hall and asked Konglin, "Have you studied the odes?" Konglin said no. Confucius said, "Without the odes, you cannot speak." Then he asked whether he had studied ritual, and Konglin said no. Confucius said, "Without ritual, you cannot stand." Later generations built this hall on that spot and named it the Hall of Poetry and Ritual. I asked him, at night, "Has anyone ever heard sounds coming from inside the wall?" Qi Xiaofeng studied history. He smiled and said, "The historical records don't mention it."
Old Zhou, though, had a different account. He said that about the Lu wall he'd heard from the older generation that at night, occasionally you could hear the sound of pages turning, rustle, rustle, very faint, like someone inside the wall reciting from a book, reciting a passage, pausing, then reciting again. This sound didn't come every year. It only appeared in years when scholars met with misfortune. In the years when the imperial examination was abolished at the end of the Qing dynasty, some people heard it. In the winter of 1966, some people heard it too.
Old Zhou said, "If you hear someone reciting in the Hall of Poetry and Ritual at night, what they're reciting is either poetry or ritual. If you make out the words, don't recite along. The moment you do, the voice in the wall stops. When it stops, it's your turn to recite." I asked Old Zhou, "Have you ever heard it?" Old Zhou said, "I don't have that kind of fortune. The people who've heard it, none of them lived long." I said, "What do you mean by that?" Old Zhou said, "Think about it. Who is it reciting inside that wall? If he lets you hear him, it means you're someone he's keeping a record of. Once he's written you down, do you think you can still get away?"
A chill ran down my spine, and I didn't ask any more.
After I left Qufu, I looked up some materials. The Lu wall is real, and the Lu wall yielding its books is a matter recorded in the historical texts. But as for the sound of books inside the wall, none of it is in the books. Only the old folks of Qufu passed it down by word of mouth, generation after generation, and by the time it reached my ears it had already been passed down for over 2,000 years. Things that are 2,000 years old, believe them or not, they're still there. In the winter of 1966, a group of students from Beijing came to Qufu. The one leading them was a female student surnamed Tan. Young, not old, with a very loud voice. They stayed in the Confucius mansion, held struggle sessions during the day, smashed steels, pulled down statues, and threw the spirit tablet of Confucius from the Dashang Hall into the street and set it on fire. Old Zhou said that in those days the entrance to the Confucius temple was packed with people, with gongs and drums making a racket like New Year and yet not like New Year.
The biggest thing of all was digging up Confucius's tomb.
Old Zhou said that during those days, the Red Guards put up tents in the Confucius forest and brought in excavators to dig up Confucius's tomb. The forest keepers were all driven out of the woods and forbidden to come near. Old Lu didn't leave. Old Lu was Old Zhou's master, over 60 that year, and had watched over the Confucius forest his whole life. He'd seen every kind of scene there was. Taking advantage of the night, he climbed over the wall into the woods, hid in the cypress grove east of Confucius's tomb, and watched for an entire night.
Old Lu later told Old Zhou that what he saw in the woods that night, he could never forget for the rest of his life. The excavator rumbled all day long, and a big stretch of earth in front of the tomb was dug open. In the deep of the night, the machine stopped, and the workers all pulled back, leaving only 2 students holding kerosene lanterns to keep watch at the edge of the burial pit. Old Lu lay in the bushes, cold and sleepy, just about to doze off, when he suddenly heard movement from deep in the woods. He said the sound was strange, like the footsteps of a group of people, very even, very light, walking all the way down from the spirit path until they reached the edge of the burial pit, where they stopped. Those 2 students on guard heard it too. They lifted their lanterns and shone them around in every direction, nothing there. The 2 muttered to each other, cursed a few times, and sat back down. Old Lu said that at just that moment, he saw a figure stand up inside the burial pit. When Old Zhou got to this part of the story, he stopped, rolled himself a cigarette, lit it, and went a long time without saying anything.
I asked him, what happened after that? Old Zhou said, Old Lu didn't get a clear look. He said the figure stood up from the pit, not tall, like a half-grown kid, and walked off toward the depths of the woods. It didn't walk fast, swaying a little this way and that, and once it reached under the shadows of the cypress trees, it was gone. The next morning, the excavator came again and kept digging. When they got to noon, a pair of footprints appeared in the pit, leading from the bottom of the pit all the way up to the ground, heading east. The footprints weren't big, like a child's, but the edge of the pit was full of people, and no one had seen anyone go down there.
Those 2 rows of footprints later became a knotty problem. The Red Guard's side said some kid had been up to mischief. The Forest Keeper's side didn't say a word. After that, the tomb-digging business somehow fizzled out. The steel was put back up, and the earth was filled back in. And so the winter of 1966 passed. Old Zhou said that in those days he was also called to meetings, told to confess the crimes of the Confucius mansion. He couldn't get a single word out, and someone slapped him twice across the face. His father was in his 50s that year and was assigned to carry steels. He carried them for 3 days, then came back and lay in bed for half a month. During that half month his father lay in bed. Old Zhou brought him his meals every day. Once, after his father had drunk a little wine, he said to Old Zhou, "This place, the Confucius forest, don't mind that it's all chaos right now. When the chaos is over, it'll still be what it is. Trees outlast people. Steels outlast people. Even the dirt outlasts people. When people are done tearing things up, the trees are still there, the steels are still there, the dirt is still there."
During the tomb-digging days, the forest keepers were driven out of the woods by day, and at night they crouched by the base of the walls and listened. Old Zhou said that in those nights, the woods were eerily silent, even the birds didn't call. On ordinary nights, the Confucius forest had plenty of birds, and owls called all night long. In those days, not one.
I asked him again, and that female student surnamed Tan? Old Zhou said, word has it that not many years after she went back to Beijing, she fell raving mad, out of her mind, and finally died in a mental hospital. Old Zhou said this in a very even tone, as if telling a story about something that had nothing to do with him. I asked him whether it was true. Old Zhou said, true or not, you can check it yourself. All the old folks in Qufu know about it.
Old Lu died in 1983 and was buried on the outskirts of the Confucius forest. Before he died, he called Old Zhou to his side and said, "The things in the woods, you've seen them all. Remember one thing, what can be told to others, tell, what can't be told, rot in your gut." In my whole life, one thing rotted in mine.
Old Zhou asked him which one.
Old Lu didn't answer. That same night, he was gone. I stayed at Old Zhou's place for 4 days. During the day I followed him on his forest patrols. At night I listened to him talk about the old days. The more he talked, the stronger the thought in my head grew. I wanted to go into the forest at night.
Old Zhou wouldn't agree at first. He said, "You're an outsider, first time in Qufu, and you dare go into the forest of Confucius at night? In 2,000 years the forest has buried 100,000 graves. Any patch of earth you step on has an owner underneath. If you go in at night and disturb whoever's down there, you'll have to answer to them." I said, "I won't disturb anyone. I just want to look."
Old Zhou couldn't talk me out of it. In the end he gave me a bundle of incense and a box of matches. He said, "When you go into the forest, go before Confucius's tomb first, light 3 sticks of incense, kowtow 3 times, and make clear you've come to pay respects, not to break in. You have to be out before the incense burns down. And whatever you hear, whatever you see, don't call anyone's name, and don't look back."
I said, "Got it."
That night the moon was very good. I waited until the light in Old Zhou's room went out, then slipped out the door. Old Zhou had already unlocked the west side gate, the key was hanging on the latch, and I pushed it open and went in. Once in the forest, I first passed a grove of cypress trees. The forest was so quiet it was frightening, only the sound of my own footsteps crunching on fallen leaves, rustle, rustle, like someone walking behind me. I made it to the front of the offering hall. The doors were shut, and through the crack it was pitch black, nothing to see. I stood at the bottom of the steps, remembered what old Zhou had said, didn't dare linger, went around the hall, and headed toward Confucius's tomb. The stone men and stone beasts on both sides of the spirit path loomed faintly in the moonlight, their shadows stretched long, pressing against the ground like living things. I reached the Zhushui Bridge. Sure enough, there was the sound of water underneath, splash, splash, unhurried, like a river flowing beneath a dry riverbed. I shone my flashlight down. The riverbed was clean and bare, not even a puddle. The sound was coming from under the earth. I stood at the head of the bridge listening for a moment, didn't dare linger, and followed the walkway toward Confucius's tomb. I counted the stone men and stone beasts along the spirit path, 12 on the left, 12 on the right, 24 figures in all. The next day I went and counted again in daylight, still 24. But that night I'd felt something was off. Later I remembered, that night, when I counted a third time, there were 25.
Confucius's tomb was behind the offering hall. A small earthen mound with a stone stele in front, its lettering unreadable in the moonlight. Before the tomb sat a stone offering table, a stone incense burner, and a stone candlestick. On the table were a few dried-out offerings of fruit, and at the very back sat a yellow paper bundle, square and neat, the size of a fist. I couldn't tell what was inside. I did as old Zhou had said. Lit 3 sticks of incense, put them in the burner, knelt and kowtowed 3 times, then withdrew to the cypress tree by the walkway and squatted down to wait.
The incense burned slowly. The night wind was light, and the cypress shadows swayed gently in the moonlight. I squatted for about a quarter of an hour, not a sound anywhere, and was just beginning to relax when I suddenly heard footsteps behind me. The sound was slow, light, one step, like an old man in cloth shoes walking on stone slabs. It came from the direction of the offering hall, step by step, up to the front of Confucius's tomb, and stopped. I held my breath and didn't dare move. In the moonlight, there was no one before Confucius's tomb. The incense in the burner was still burning, the smoke rising straight up.
The footsteps paused a moment, then sounded again, this time heading east. To the east was the spot where Zi Gong had kept vigil at the tomb, a dark, indistinct stretch where nothing could be seen.
The footsteps faded into the distance and were gone. I squatted until the incense burned out, cleaned up the ashes, and made my way back out of the forest the same way I'd come. The next morning, I told old Zhou what had happened during the night. When I got to the part about the footsteps stopping in front of Confucius' tomb, old Zhou was picking vegetables. His hands froze, the leaves fell into the basin, and he didn't pick them up for a long while.
He said, "You heard clearly, they were heading east?"
I said yes, east, into that cypress grove by the spot where Zi Gong kept vigil at the grave.
Old Zhou put the cleaned vegetables into the basket, wiped his hands, and said, "You got lucky. Those footsteps, not every forest keeper has heard them. I heard my father say that the stretch of path in front of Confucius' tomb isn't meant for the living to walk. When a living person walks those steps, there's stone underfoot. When someone who isn't living walks them, there's empty air. The fact that you could hear it stop behind you means it took you for a guest, not an outsider."
I said, "And if I'd called out to it?"
Old Zhou shot me a look. "If you'd called out, you wouldn't have come back. The Confucius forest has 100,000 graves. One more of you wouldn't be missed, one fewer wouldn't be noticed either." A chill ran down my spine again, and I didn't dare ask any more. At lunch, I told Qi Xiaofeng about the yellow paper package on the offering table. Qi Xiaofeng said that when his advisor was sorting through the Confucius Mansion archives, He'd come across a Republican-era record stating that offerings left in the Confucius forest were collected by the forest keepers on holidays and buried together in a plot at the southeast corner of the woods. People were not allowed to eat them. Whoever ate them bore the consequences himself. He said that rule was still in effect up until liberation. I said, then what was in the yellow paper package? Qi Xiaofeng said, the archives didn't say. Maybe it was a piece of pastry, maybe something else. He paused, then added, Old Zhou would know for sure. He's kept watch here for over 40 years, there's nothing he doesn't know.
That afternoon, I went back into the forest by myself. There were plenty of people in the daytime, tour group after tour group, guides holding up little flags in front of Confucius' tomb telling the story of Zi Gong's morning vigil. I squeezed up to the tomb for a look. The stone offering table was bare. A few sticks of incense from tourists stuck in the burner. Last night's yellow paper package was gone.
I asked a young forest keeper standing by the forest gate, do you guys collect the things left on the offering table? The young man said, nobody collects things off the offering table. Whoever puts them there takes them away. If the person who left them doesn't take them, they just sit there, wind, sun, rot, dissolve. Eventually they're gone on their own. I said, last night there was a yellow paper package there. The young man glanced at me, so you were in the forest last night too? I nodded.
The young man didn't say anything else. He turned and walked away. That evening, I told Old Zhou about the yellow paper package. Old Zhou listened, stayed silent for a long while, then said, that thing wasn't coming for you. You saw it, didn't touch it, so you're fine. If you'd touched it, today you'd be the one lying here talking to me.
He said, in the spring of 2002, a tourist from out of town was strolling through the Confucius forest. When no one was watching, he took 2 offering fruits from in front of the stone beast and stuffed them into his pocket. The next day, that man ran a high fever in his hotel, 40 degrees. He kept talking nonsense, saying a group of people in ancient clothes were standing by his bed, asking him where the things were. His family was terrified. They hurried to the entrance of the Confucius forest, bought incense, candles, and offering fruits, went back to that stone beast, put the things back, knelt down, and kowtowed 3 times. That very night, the fever broke. Old Zhou said, things in the forest, if you don't take them, they don't bother you, if you take them, they follow you. In 2,000 years, the Confucius forest has had just this one rule. I said, what if someone takes something on purpose? Old Zhou said, the ones who take on purpose, none of them ever leave Qufu. Don't ask whether it's true or not, it's what the old folks handed down. Better to believe it than not. If you believe it, at worst you get stuck with the label of superstitious. If you don't believe it and you really run into it, you won't even have the chance to regret.
The next evening, I ran into that young forest worker again at the entrance to the Confucius forest. When he saw me, he froze for a moment, like he wanted to say something, but didn't. He lowered his head and walked off. That night, Old Zhou told me, that kid's name is Xiao Zhou, his nephew, also works in the forest. Xiao Zhou told him that when I asked him about the yellow paper package, my eyes were red, as if I'd been crying. Old Zhou said, whether your eyes were red the night you went into the forest, you know in your own heart. I thought about it. That night, squatting under the cypress, the wind was strong.
Old Zhou said that in 1958, the whole country was flattening graves. The unmarked, abandoned graves around the edge of Konglin, the Confucius Forest Cemetery, were leveled one after another. Grave mounds were pushed flat, gravestones were hauled away, and for the shallow burials, the coffins were left exposed.
At that time, the whole country was flattening graves to return the land to farmland. Most of those graves around the edge of Konglin were old, unmarked ones, whose they were, no one could say. No one dared touch the graves of the direct Kong family line. What they went after were the graves of people with other surnames on the outer edges. Old Zhou said his father had told him that during the flattening, they'd level graves by day, and at night people would secretly pile the dirt back up. Pile it up, level it again, pile it up. This went on for the better part of half a year. Eventually the commune stopped caring, and the whole thing just fizzled out. One time, they got to a small grave on the southwest corner of Konglin. The grave wasn't big, and the headstone was small too, its inscription worn beyond legibility. Several men dug open the earth and exposed a black lacquered coffin. The coffin was intact, the lacquer hadn't even peeled much. The team leader ordered them to open it.
The moment the lid was lifted, everyone froze. There were no bones in the coffin. It was lined with a thick layer of yellow silk, and in the middle of the silk sat a bronze mirror, face down, pressed against the fabric.
The team leader was bold. He reached in and flipped the mirror over. The instant it turned, he let out a cry, his hand jerked, and the mirror fell back into the coffin. The people nearby asked him what was wrong. His face was white as paper, and he said, "The person in the mirror wasn't me." Old Zhou's father had been right there at the time, but he hadn't seen what was in the mirror. He said that cry from the team leader, he still remembered it to this day. It wasn't pain, wasn't fear. It was a sound forced out from the back of the throat, like someone had seen something they couldn't put into words. That same night, the team leader fell ill, high fever, delirious rambling, going back and forth on just one sentence, "The person in the mirror isn't me, the person in the mirror isn't me." On the morning of the third day, he was gone. People from the commune came to investigate, found nothing wrong, and in the end it was handled as a sudden illness.
That coffin was buried back in the ground, the bronze mirror buried with it. The grave mound was heaped up again, and no one dared flatten it a second time. From then on, that plot on the southwest corner of Konglin was never touched again. Old Zhou's father, later on, would secretly go there to burn a few sheets of ghost money on the 1st and 15th of every lunar month.
Old Zhou said, "Konglin hasn't dried up in 2,000 years. It's not because of good feng shui. It's because there's something in the woods that won't let it dry up. You touch its things, and it won't let you live."
I asked, "Then what exactly was in that bronze mirror?"
Old Zhou said, "My father took it to his grave. He only said that the mirror is still in that grave now, face down, pressed against the silk. Whenever you pass by that plot of land, don't look down." Qi Xiaofeng told me that the 27th day of the 8th lunar month was Confucius's birthday, and the Confucius forest was going to hold a memorial ceremony, closing the forest for 3 days. I said that worked out well, I'd just stay 2 more days. Old Zhou heard this and said nothing, only went for a walk in the forest every evening, coming back after dark.
The night before the birthday, Old Zhou suddenly said to me, "Tomorrow night, don't go out."
I said, "Why? Isn't the forest closed? I can't get in anyway." Old Zhou said, "The closure only keeps out tourists. Those who are supposed to come will come all the same. Tomorrow is the 27th of the 8th month. Once the hour of the rat arrives, someone will walk the spirit road." I said, "What kind of someone?" Old Zhou said, "Someone you can't see."
I said yes on the surface, but curiosity stirred inside me again. The next day, the memorial ceremony for Confucius was held in the Confucius Temple. A platform was set up beneath the Wanren Palace wall. People in ancient costumes lined up in 2 rows, playing ancient music and performing the 8-row dance. The drumbeats thumped so hard you could hear them across the city wall. The crowd watching was massive, some from out of town, some locals. I squeezed into the crowd and saw Old Zhou standing at the foot of the city wall too, watching from afar, his face expressionless.
Back at Old Zhou's place that night, I asked him again, "The ones you can't see, do they come to watch the spectacle, or to pay respects?"
Old Zhou said, "They all come to pay respects. For over 2,000 years, every year on the 27th of the 8th month, they come. What you saw in daylight was a show. What you see at night, that's the real day.
I tossed and turned in bed. When it got close to 11, once the light in old Zhou's room went out, I quietly got up and slipped into the forest through the west side gate. The gate wasn't locked. Old Zhou actually knew I would go, he didn't lock it, and he didn't stop me. I stood outside the second forest gate, not going in. The moon was half hidden behind clouds. The spirit road ran straight into the darkness, the stone men and stone beasts on both sides faintly visible, like a row of silent guards. I checked my watch. 11:05. The hour of the rat. At the far end of the spirit road, near the Confucius temple, something suddenly moved. It wasn't the wind, wasn't tree shadows, it was a mass of darkness, a shade darker than the night itself, slowly moving toward me from the other end of the spirit road. It walked very slowly, very steadily, like a person in a long robe, step by step, unhurried. The dark mass reached the front of the offering hall and stopped. I heard an extremely faint sound in the wind, a low hum, like many people murmuring together in low voices, or like someone striking a chime in the far distance. I suddenly remembered the daytime. After the ceremony had dispersed, I walked along the spirit road on my own, counting the stone statues, 24 of them. Not one more, not one less. But now, standing outside the second forest gate, counting by moonlight, I stopped at the 25th. At the far end of the spirit road, under the eaves of the offering hall, there was one extra shadow of a stone beast. One that hadn't been there in daylight.
I didn't dare move, even my breathing went light. The sound went on for a while, then the dark mass moved again. This time it didn't head for Confucius's tomb, but turned east, passed by Zi Gong's hut where he had mourned his master, and disappeared into the depths of the cypress grove.
I stood outside the second forest gate until the moon came out from the clouds. Someone spoke behind me, and it startled me. Old Zhou was standing behind me, who knows since when, a cigarette in his mouth, the tip glowing and fading. He said, "Seen enough?"
I said, "When did you get here?" Old Zhou said, "I followed you out the door. I was afraid you'd cry out." He said, "You saw what you saw. Don't say it out loud. If you say it, it will know you're watching it."
The day before I left Qufu, Old Zhou took me to see the scholar tree. The scholar tree was still the same as ever, the northern branches dry and withered, the southern branches green. Old Zhou stood beneath the tree, tilting his head up to look for a while, then said, "Look, it's sprouted new buds again." I leaned in close. Sure enough, at the tip of the southern branch, there was a cluster of tender buds, goose yellow, trembling in the autumn wind.
Old Zhou said, "This tree, back when my grandpa was a kid, it was already like this. Half dead, half alive. My grandpa said it's waiting for something. When that thing is settled, it'll come fully alive." I asked, "Waiting for what?"
Old Zhou didn't answer. He squatted down, lit a cigarette, smoked half of it, and only then said, "I entered the forest when I was 18. Today makes 49 years. The things I've seen in the forest, I remember them all, the things I haven't seen, I remember those too. You ask me whether I believe it or not, let me put it to you this way, in 2000 years, the Kong forest has never had a single empty day in the graves. When you come during the day, it's scenery, when you come at night to listen, it's something else."
I said, "Something else what?"
Old Zhou stubbed out his cigarette and said, "Something else what? I can't say for sure. All I know is, the spirits of the Zhushui River are still flowing beneath the riverbed. The books in the Lu wall are still rustling inside the wall, and the stone statues are still patrolling the forest at night. The Kong forest has never had an empty day in the graves because it's always had someone watching over it. The forest keepers change, one batch after another, but the forest itself keeps count in its heart."
The night before I left, Qi Xiaofeng invited me to dinner. He said, "You've been in the Kong forest these past few days, old Zhou must have told you a lot. I said, he told me plenty. Qi Xiaofeng said, he's kept watch for over 40 years, and he's never talked this much with anyone. After you leave, he'll probably be on his own again. I asked him, did old Zhou ever tell you why he doesn't leave the Kong forest? Qi Xiaofeng said, he said one thing, as long as the forest is there, I'm there. If the forest is gone, then I'm gone. On the morning I left, old Zhou walked me to the mouth of the alley. He stood under the locust tree and said, come again when you have the time. The scholar tree has sprouted again, next time you come, maybe you'll see it all green. I got on the long-distance bus, and through the window I watched the city walls of Qufu grow farther and farther away. Old Zhou stood there at the mouth of the alley the whole time, until the bus turned a corner and he was out of sight. After that, I never went back to Qufu. In 2008, I heard old Zhou had passed away. He was buried in the old Zhou family grave plot on the outer edge of the Kong forest, alongside his father and his grandfather. A few years later, I came across a post online. The person who posted it said that one night, passing by the Kong forest, he saw an old man patrolling the forest on the spirit path. He wore a blue cloth jacket and walked very slowly. When spoken to, he didn't answer. He walked to the head of the Zhushui Bridge and vanished. Below the post was a photo. It showed the spirit path, with the stone figures and stone beasts on both sides looming faint in the dark, and at the far end of the path, barely visible, there was a vague human silhouette out of focus, you couldn't make out the face. Underneath, someone else had replied, saying they'd seen it too, saying that old man wasn't human, he was an old forest keeper of the Kong forest, dead and buried, but still patrolling. Someone else said that on the few steps in front of Confucius's tomb, you could always hear footsteps in the middle of the night. It's been that way for years, every single night. I stared at that photo for a long time. That figure in the blue cloth jacket, thin, dark, back slightly hunched, was the same build as old Zhou. I saved it. I never opened it again. The story's told. What do you think? If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe. New urban legend every day.